The village of St. Mary Mead had a way of looking as though nothing of importance could ever happen there. It drowsed among its hedges and elms, with a church spire that poked the sky in a mild, apologetic fashion, and cottages that appeared to have grown where they stood, like cabbages in a particularly orderly kitchen garden. That, as Miss Jane Marple sometimes reflected, was how villages lured one into a dangerous sense of security. On this particular June afternoon, Gossington Hall, home of Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, was the scene of the annual charity garden fete. Bunting fluttered in a light breeze, round tables were set out on the lawn, and the Women's Institute, in their best summer hats, bustled about with baskets and money tins. There was a white elephant stall, a bran tub, a guessing competition for the weight of the vicar, and a great deal of very respectable gossip. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, plump, energetic, and not in the least subdued by the responsibilities of hospitality, hurried from stall to stall issuing rapid instructions. Annie, do keep those children away from the sponge cakes. They poke. You can't sell a poked sponge. And where is the change box? Has anyone seen my spectacles? Jane, there you are. Miss Marple sat in a conveniently shady corner beneath a laburnum tree, a small neat figure in dove grey, a straw hat with a faded ribbon upon her white hair, and a piece of knitting on her lap. She looked harmlessly absorbed in the intricacies of a heel for a woolen sock. I do hope, she remarked mildly, that the children are confined to the coconut shy, Dolly. Children and cakes, you know, are very much like bees and jam. Dolly snorted. You always put things so unpleasantly, Jane, but you're right, of course. Her bright bird-like eyes swept the lawn. Oh, good, people are arriving. We must make a success of it, you know. Lucinda is watching. Lucinda? Inquired Miss Marple, her needles pausing. My cousin, said Dolly in a different tone. She came down yesterday. Such a business with trains, luggage. Oh, there she is. A woman had just stepped out through the French windows of the drawing-room onto the terrace. She was in her early 40s, slim, well-dressed, in navy and white, and her fair hair was waved with careful exactness. There was something a little too careful in everything about her, Miss Marple thought, observing unobtrusively. The lipstick precisely within the line, the gloves that were just too tight, the smile that came a fraction late. Dolly waved an expansive arm. Lucinda, darling, come and meet everyone. This is St. Mary Mead in all its glory. And this, she added, propelling her cousin towards the laburnum, is Miss Marple. You must be nice to her or she'll never forgive you, and she knows all our sins. Lucinda Ware smiled, a pleasant, composed smile. Her eyes, unexpectedly dark in the fair face, rested for a moment on Miss Marple. I am sure Mrs. Bantry exaggerates, she said. I hope you will allow me to trespass on your village without demanding a full confession. Miss Marple's blue eyes regarded her, mild and interested. People confess a good deal more than they intend, Mrs. Ware, when they come to the country, she said. One has time to listen. A little, very slight pause followed this remark. Then Lucinda laughed, the sound a shade too bright. From the other side of the lawn came the shrill voices of children playing hide-and-seek near the shrubbery, beyond the ornamental pond. A gramophone was beginning to grind out a foxtrot. The vicar's wife called for more chairs. Someone had mislaid the raffle tickets. It was all, as Mrs. Bantry observed with satisfaction, going off beautifully. It was at that moment that the first scream came. It was a child's scream, high and sharp, splitting the drowsy summer air. Talk broke off abruptly. Heads turned towards the line of trees. A second scream followed, longer, ending on a sort of bubbling wail. Dolly Bantry set down her plate of sandwiches with a clatter. Really? If they've fallen into the pond? Miss Marple had already risen. The knitting slipped quietly into her work-bag. No, she said very softly. That is not a pond sort of scream. They were the first two across the lawn, Dolly bustling stoutly, Miss Marple moving with surprising speed for so slight a figure. Behind them the fate dissolved into noisy confusion. In the shade of the shrubbery, by the narrow path that led towards the coppice, a little girl stood rigid, hands pressed to her mouth, eyes enormous. At her feet, in the trampled grass, lay a woman in a summer dress, terribly still. Miss Marple did not cry out. She merely drew in a small breath and looked once, closely. Dear me, she said under her breath. Oh, dear me. People did not run in St. Mary Mead as a rule, and certainly not across the lawns of Gossington Hall. Yet now chairs were overturned and teaspoons clattered to saucers as the guests surged toward the rose garden. Miss Price Ridley clutched at her pearls. Miss Hartnell demanded someone fetch the doctor, and Dolly Bantry, her face abruptly drained of colour, hurried ahead of them all with surprising speed. Miss Marple followed at a more measured pace, her sensible shoes finding the gravel path without effort. She had always thought highly of Betty as a girl of good character and steady nerves. To see her reduced to sobs and hysterics told Miss Marple that whatever lay ahead would not be pleasant. Under the rose arbour, where the June blooms were heavy and sweet, Millicent Vane lay quite still upon the narrow path. Her body was a dark, incongruous shape against the pale gravel, one arm flung out as though she had been reaching for the trellis. Her eyes stared up at the sky with a fixed astonishment that suggested she had not expected death, though Miss Marple reflected that very few people ever did. Dolly stopped short and gave a strangled little cry. For a moment she swayed, and Miss Marple, arriving beside her, put out a steadying hand on her sleeve. Colonel Bantry, summoned from his study by the commotion, arrived puffing and red-faced just as Betty began to wail again. Dr. Haydock, who had sensibly remained seated at the first sign of panic, now appeared at a brisk trot, medical bag in hand. He knelt beside the body, his expression professional and composed, and touched Millicent's wrist, then the side of her throat. His fingers lingered only a second. "Well," Dolly whispered hoarsely, "Doctor, she has only fainted, surely. The heat, she was never strong, you know." Haydock rose slowly, brushing a speck of dust from his trousers in a gesture that seemed oddly deliberate. "I am afraid, Mrs. Bantry," he said quietly, "that your sister is quite dead. Has been, I should say, for some minutes, possibly longer." A collective shiver passed through the little crowd. Miss Marple noticed that Dolly did not collapse or scream. Instead, she grew very still, her round face taking on an expression almost of relief before being quickly rearranged into proper grief. It was, Miss Marple thought, exactly like watching Mrs. Bartlett's cat when the budgerigars' cage had fallen, and yet the bird miraculously still lived. There had been disappointment first, then instant decorum. "Heart," ventured Mrs. Price Ridley from the back, a hopeful note in her voice that suggested natural causes would disappoint her almost as much as they did the cat. "Such a sudden seizure." Dr. Haydock's mouth hardened. "Possibly," he said, "but I shall not be signing any certificate just yet. Colonel, I must ask that no one touch the body. This is a matter for the police." He looked around, searching each familiar face with sudden new caution. The guests were shepherded back toward the terrace, though nobody truly wished to leave the vicinity of the rose garden. Conversations broke out in anxious whispers, each sentence beginning with "of course" and ending with "murder." Miss Marple, now ensconced once more in her garden chair, appeared to be counting her stitches, but her attention flickered from face to face like a discreet searchlight. Dolly Bantry sank down beside her, fingers twisting a handkerchief. "Jane, I cannot bear it," she murmured. "For Millicent to die here of all places, after only one night. It looks so dreadful." "Death rarely chooses convenient moments, dear," Miss Marple replied gently, "though I confess I should like to know why she chose to come now after so very long." Dolly flinched, and Miss Marple observed the slight hesitation before she answered. "She wrote quite out of the blue, said she had business in England and thought it time we were reconciled, that was all." "People seldom travel great distances for all," Miss Marple remarked mildly. "Did she speak of money, perhaps, or of the past?" Before Dolly could reply, Inspector Slack approached, notebook in hand. "I shall need a list of everyone present, Mrs. Bantry. Also your servants and anyone who might have come or gone by the side gate. I'm placing the house under temporary restriction. No one leaves without my knowledge." Dolly nodded miserably. Miss Marple looked up at the inspector with apparent innocence. "You will find it useful, I dare say, to learn where Mrs. Vane had been living all these years. Foreign parts can be so unsettling. People acquire new habits," Slack snorted. "Poisons are hardly new habits, Miss Marple. Still, we'll trace her movements. I'm more interested in what she stirred up by coming here. 30 years' silence doesn't end over a cup of tea without a reason." With that, he strode away, and Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest of nods. The inspector, though occasionally obtuse, had an instinct for trouble. Presently the vicar's wife, Mrs. Granger, fluttered over, visibly torn between horror and curiosity. "They're saying at the gate that Millicent Vane was quite notorious abroad," she confided breathlessly. "A companion to some titled lady with a very unfortunate fondness for speculation, shares and such. I suppose that explains the clothes. Poor Dolly to be faced with all that talk." Miss Marple considered this. Companions saw and heard much that was not meant for their ears, and women who gambled with money often gambled with lives, if only indirectly. "Notoriety is such an imprecise word," she said. "It can mean almost anything one wishes it to mean." At that moment Betty passed by, carrying a tray of abandoned cups. Her eyes were red, but there was a hunted look in them that spoke of more than simple shock. Miss Marple watched the girl disappear into the house, and her fingers resumed their steady knitting. She had seen that same expression before in village maids who knew much. Inspector Slack followed Colonel Bantry into the smaller sitting room, closing the door firmly behind them. The murmur of their voices reached the drawing room in indistinct fragments. "Will come out anyway." Legal matter. Inheritance. Words that made the assembled guests shift, uncomfortably. In St. Mary Mead, money spoken of in low tones always suggested something rather more serious than mere pounds and shillings. Miss Marple continued to knit, the steady click of her needles providing a gentle counterpoint to the tension in the room. She had always believed that when people thought one was engaged in something wholly trivial, they tended to forget one was present at all. It was a belief daily confirmed by experience. Mrs. Price Ridley leaned closer to Mrs. Weatherby and whispered, not quite as quietly as she imagined, "I never trusted that Mrs. Bantry entirely. All that gaiety and those parties, it's unnatural in a woman of her age." Miss Marple's lips twitched almost imperceptibly. In her experience, people distrusted in others precisely those qualities they most secretly envied. After what seemed a very long time, but was in fact scarcely 15 minutes, the door opened again. Inspector Slack reappeared, followed by Dolly Bantry. Dolly's eyes were red, but her chin had a certain set to it that Miss Marple recognised as defiance under pressure. "Inspector," Dolly said before he could speak, addressing the room rather than him, "it seems my private affairs are to become public property, so I may as well tell you all, myself." She took a deep breath. 30 years ago, my father died. He left our family estate, not an enormous one, but comfortable, to be divided equally between Millicent and myself. Only when the will was finally read, nearly everything had gone to Millicent. I received a much smaller portion than expected. Colonel Bantry shifted uneasily, but Dolly forged on. "I was young and perhaps rather dramatic. I accused Millicent of influencing father, of persuading him I was frivolous and irresponsible. There were terrible scenes. Millicent denied everything, of course, but I never forgave her. We parted. We have not met or spoken since, until yesterday evening." Inspector Slack cleared his throat. "And yesterday, Mrs. Bantry? What passed between you and your sister then?" "We argued," Dolly said simply. "I had imagined, hoped, that time might have softened things. But Millicent came not to make peace, but to gloat. She said father had been right about me. She spoke of her property as her investments. Then she said," Dolly's voice wavered, "she said she had amended her own will in my favour, that as her only living relative I would inherit everything. She thought it generous. I thought it cruel." The silence that followed was thick and meaningful. A sister, long estranged, returns, announces that her fortune will descend upon the woman she once cheated. By the simple arithmetic of crime, Dolly Bantry had just provided herself with the strongest possible motive for murder. Inspector Slack's eyes gleamed with unpleasant satisfaction. "So, your sister, who deprived you of your rightful inheritance, arrives to tell you that you are now to receive it after all, provided, of course, that she dies first." "It wasn't like that," Dolly cried, her composure finally cracking. "I didn't want her money. I wanted—" She broke off. "Justice," suggested Slack. "Revenge? You argued last night by your own admission. She is found poisoned today. At your party, in your garden, having drunk tea served from your household's tray. You must see how this appears, Mrs. Bantry." Miss Marple's fingers did not falter over the wool, but her eyes grew thoughtful. Appearances, she knew, were exactly what clever murderers relied upon, and Inspector Slack, with his comfortable preference for obvious suspects, was precisely the sort of audience such people appreciated. Her gaze drifted toward the French doors, through which she could just see the edge of the rose arbour, now cordoned off with a grim piece of police tape. A light-coloured coat, she had said earlier, someone moving quickly, not wishing to be observed. There had been something else as well, a faint sound, almost like a stifled sob from that direction before Betty's scream. Entirely natural under the circumstances, perhaps, or perhaps not. As Dolly sat down heavily, face buried in a crumpled handkerchief, Miss Marple reflected that while money was a powerful motive, it was rarely the only one. Old injuries, youthful follies, disappointed love, these too left scars that sometimes bled decades later. And in her long life, she had never yet known a quarrel over inheritance that was quite as simple as it first appeared. Outside, the shadows in the garden were beginning to lengthen. It would not be long before evening fell over St. Mary Mead, bringing with it the comfortable illusion of safety. But Miss Marple, watching Dolly Bantry's shaking shoulders, felt with a small chill that the day's true darkness had only just begun. Inspector Slack halted at the foot of the stairs, as though savouring the drama of the moment. Dolly Bantry remained motionless on the landing, her hand gripping the banister so tightly that her knuckles showed white against the polished wood. "Are you saying," she asked steadily, "that you believe I put poison in my own sister's tea?" Slack cleared his throat in a way that managed to be both official and self-important. "I'm saying, madam, that the circumstances are highly suspicious, and that you had the strongest motive of anyone present." "Nonsense," interjected Colonel Bantry hotly. Dolly wouldn't hurt a floke of Miss Marple, who had seen Dolly Bantry dispose of more than one marauding wasp with decisive accuracy, allowed this statement to pass unchallenged. She rose with apparent effort, letting her knitting fall into her basket. "If I might suggest, Inspector," she said gently, "that Mrs. Bantry is quite exhausted. Perhaps you would obtain what information you need in a more private setting. The drawing-room is so very imposing at times like these." Slack hesitated. There was, Miss Marple knew, nothing. An ambitious officer disliked more than the appearance of being guided, yet he was sufficiently aware of the village sensibilities to see the wisdom of her suggestion. "Very well," he said shortly. "Mrs. Bantry, if you would be so good as to join me in the library. Colonel, you may accompany your wife." As the three of them withdrew, the remaining guests began to murmur among themselves, voices dropping instinctively, though no one had yet told them to keep silence. The sense of being witnesses to something profoundly indecorous weighed heavily upon them. Miss Marple moved unobtrusively toward the French windows, ostensibly to admit a little air. In reality, she wished to see once more the path that led toward the rose arbour. The gravel bore the faint impressions of hurried footsteps, a confusion of marks now, owing to the comings and goings since the tragedy. Yet among them she thought she discerned the sharper outline of a narrow heel. She remembered again the glimpse of a light-coloured coat moving swiftly along that selfsame path. Many of the village ladies wore sensible dark serge or floral prints that day. Only two, Miss Marple recalled, had chosen pale coats, young Susan Bantry in cream, and Mrs. Price Ridley in a shade she herself described as fawn, though others might have said mud. Turning back into the room, she found Susan standing close to the mantelpiece, twisting a lace handkerchief between nervous fingers. The girl started slightly when she realised Miss Marple was observing her. "Such a dreadful thing, dear," Miss Marple said in her mildest tone. "You were very fond of your Aunt Millicent, I collect?" Susan hesitated, then lifted her chin with sudden determination. "I scarcely knew her, Aunt Jane. She never visited. But last night she sent for me to her room. She said she might be able to help me, in London, with a position. Only—" The girl faltered. Inspector Slack pounced first, like a dog who had scented new game. "Ruined, eh? And what exactly did you spill on it, Miss Susan?" Susan swallowed, her fingers tightening around her handbag until the knuckles showed white. "Tea," she said at last. I spilled tea on it in the garden. It was clumsy of me." Miss Marple regarded the girl with mild interest. "Such a pity. It was a very pretty frock, though tea, in my experience, rarely ruins a gown beyond salvage. A little cold water and salt works wonders, unless, of course, there was something else in the tea." Susan's eyes flashed briefly towards Raymond, an involuntary glance, swiftly withdrawn, but it did not escape Miss Marple. Nor did Raymond's almost imperceptible shake of the head. A warning or a plea, it was hard to say which. Inspector Slack's gaze moved from one to the other. "You two seem remarkably concerned about each other's reactions," he observed. "Perhaps we'll deal with you one at a time. Miss Bantry, where were you during the half-hour before Mrs. Vane was found?" "In the house," Susan replied quickly. "Mostly in my room. I came down just before the scream. Betty will tell you. She brought up a fresh jug of water." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but inwardly she noted the careful phrasing. "Mostly in my room." So many dangerous little adverbs in cases like these. "Very well," Slack said shortly. "You'll give a full statement before you leave. Now, Mr. West, your father's firm was handling Mrs. Vane's legal affairs, and you were in Much Benham this morning, that's correct?" Raymond drew himself up with an effort at dignity, though his face remained pale. "I fail to see how my movements earlier in the day can have any bearing." "They bear," Slack cut in harshly, "because the deceased arranged to change her will through your father's firm, because she died before she could keep that appointment, and because you neglected to mention any of this when you arrived at the scene of her death. Now answer the question, sir." "Yes," Raymond had said, finally. "I was at my father's office. I had business of my own there. Literary contracts, nothing to do with Mrs. Vane. I knew of her intended appointment only in the vaguest way. My father mentioned it over breakfast as an example of tiresome clients who can't make up their minds. Miss Marple looked at him steadily. Did he now? And did he say in whose favour she intended to alter her will this time? Raymond hesitated almost imperceptibly. To charity, I understood, he said at last. A home for distressed gentlewomen or something of the sort. How very altruistic, Mrs. Price Ridley remarked acidly from her chair. Changing wills as often as hairstyles. One wonders why anyone bothered to murder her at all. She might have disinherited half the county by Tuesday. The remark, intended as sarcasm, gave Miss Marple pause. People who change their wills frequently do create enemies, she reflected. Not merely among those disinherited, but among those perpetually on the verge of inheritance. Forever. Tantalised and forever uncertain. Inspector Slack appeared to have reached a decision. Right. No one leaves this house without my permission. I'll have statements from each of you and Mrs. Bantry. He turned sharply toward Dolly, who still stood halfway down the stairs. You'll remain available. I'm making no arrest yet, but the fact remains. Your sister dies in your garden, poisoned at your party, with a long history of ill feeling between you. It doesn't look at all good. Dolly lifted her head with the sudden, almost desperate spirit. If you think I poisoned Millicent for money, Inspector, you're a bigger fool than I took you for. I wouldn't have lifted a finger to save her from herself 30 years ago, and I certainly wouldn't dirty my hands killing her now. But there are people in this village who had far more to fear from Millicent alive than I ever did. Such as? Slack demanded. Dolly hesitated, then looked directly at Miss Marple. She recognised people today, people who would have preferred to remain unnoticed. She said something at luncheon, a remark I didn't understand at the time. Some of the ghosts in this place still walk in daylight. I thought she was being dramatic as usual. Now I'm not so sure. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking gently in the silence that followed. Ghosts that walked in daylight, and a woman who had returned after 30 years with the power not merely to change her will, but perhaps to change other lives entirely. It was not only money that had died with Millicent Vane, she suspected, but also the truth about an older crime, one that someone insane. Mary Mead was determined should remain buried. Inspector Slack seized upon Susan's faltering answer. Ruined, was it? Spilled what exactly, Miss Bantry? Susan licked her lips. Tea. I was carrying a cup for Aunt Dolly and stumbled on the gravel. It went all down the front. I changed before anyone noticed. Miss Marple's eyes rested on the girl's pale face. Such a pity, she said mildly. It was a very pretty shade of blue. I dare say cook will remember whether the tea was sweetened or if it had milk. Such stains are so difficult to remove. Susan flinched. I don't see what that matters. It may matter a great deal, Inspector Slack cut in. You will bring me that dress, Miss Bantry, immediately, and you will not attempt to wash it. His gaze shifted abruptly to Raymond. As for you, Mr. West, we've not forgotten you. Why were you in Much Benham this morning? Raymond straightened, clearly making an effort at nonchalance. I went to see my father at the office, if you must know. As Miss Marple correctly surmised, Carruthers and West is his firm. He mentioned in passing that an old client of his, Mrs. Vane, had written about altering her will. I was curious whom she intended to benefit. Curious, Slack repeated sceptically. Or anxious, hoping perhaps that she might remember her poor relations at Gossington Hall. Raymond coloured. My aunt and uncle have no children of their own. It wasn't unreasonable to suppose I might be considered, but my father told me nothing definite. Solicitor's confidentiality and all that. I came on here as planned. That is all. Miss Marple, who had known Raymond West since he was a tousle-headed boy, reflected privately that he had never possessed a talent for economical truth. He tended either to embroider extravagantly or to omit just enough to be suspicious. Susan returned presently with the blue dress over her arm. Even at a distance, Miss Marple could see a dark, spreading stain across the bodice. Too small for an entire cup of tea and oddly placed. Inspector Slack took it with ill-disguised triumph. Sergeant, you'll see this goes to the laboratory and county. They can tell us soon enough whether that's tea or something rather more lethal. Dolly Bantry descended a few steps, her hand on the rail. Susan had nothing to do with this, she said desperately. She adored Millicent. But no, I mustn't. You must, Slack said sharply. What exactly was the relationship between your niece and your sister, Mrs. Bantry? Dolly's shoulders sagged. Millicent took a fancy to Susan's brains, if you must know. She'd been paying for her secretarial course in London, on the condition it was kept from me. She said I'd only fuss. They wrote to one another, met in town. Susan looked upon her almost as a fairy godmother. Miss Marple's fingers resumed their gentle clicking. a benefactress whose money was about to be diverted to charity, a young girl whose prospects depended upon that generosity, a nephew who had perhaps counted on a legacy to free him from the necessity of serious work, circles of dependence and resentment overlapping like ripples in a pond. "And where were you, Miss Bantry?" Slack asked, between the time Betty took the tea to the rose arbour and the moment she screamed. Susan swallowed. I went down the yew walk. I didn't feel very well. I was sick behind the shrubbery." "Sick from what?" Slack demanded. Susan hesitated fractionally. It was enough. Miss Marple saw that moment of calculation, the choice of which truth to tell and which to bury. She had seen it before in less serious matters, in the village girl concealing an indiscretion, in the errand boy who had broken a window and blamed the wind. "From the heat," Susan said finally. Miss Marple bent over her knitting to hide the sudden sharpness in her gaze. Heat indeed. People were so very seldom sick from the heat in English gardens, yet they were quite often sick from fright, or from the knowledge that a fatal plan had been set in motion and could no longer be recalled. Inspector Slack's eyes glittered as he regarded Susan, who stood trapped between the kitchen table and the scullery door like a cornered bird. "Miss Bantry, I must insist you fetch that blue dress at once. It may prove very important indeed." Susan opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her gaze flickered to Dolly, who had followed them in and now leaned heavily against the doorframe. For the first time, Miss Marple saw something in Dolly's expression that was not grief or shock, but a fierce protective determination. "My niece is in no state," Dolly began, but Susan straightened suddenly, as if making a decision. "It's in my room," she said hoarsely. "I'll fetch it." "I'll send the sergeant with you," Slack replied briskly. "No one is to go anywhere in this house unattended." As Susan and the sergeant disappeared, Miss Marple turned her attention back to the waste bin. That tiny scrap of blue silk, clinging so obstinately to the rough metal edge, seemed to her more eloquent than any spoken statement. It suggested haste, someone thrusting something in carelessly, anxious to be done with it. Betty hovered near the stove, twisting her apron in nervous hands. "I only emptied the smaller bin into that one a quarter of an hour before the party," she whispered to Miss Marple when Slack's attention turned momentarily elsewhere. "There wasn't nothing in it then but potato peelings and such. That bottle, that's new, and the bit of dress too." Miss Marple nodded gently. "You have a good memory, Betty. It's an invaluable quality in a housemaid. Things are so easily misremembered in times of excitement." Upstairs, doors opened and closed. Footsteps hurried along the landing. The oppressive stillness of the kitchen settled again, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock above the mantel. Dolly moved to the table and gripped its edge with both hands, her knuckles whitening. "Millicent always did poison everything she touched," she said suddenly, in a low, bitter voice. "Lives, reputations, hopes. That she should go by actual poison in the end." She stopped herself with an effort, aware of all eyes on her. Miss Marple studied her old friend for a long moment. Dolly's resentment was real and long nurtured, but resentment alone did not make a murderer, any more than proximity to a crime made one guilty. Human beings, in her experience, required a compelling immediate cause to act on their darker impulses. Susan's return broke the heavy silence. She entered the kitchen carrying the crumpled blue dress, the sergeant close behind. The garment, once pretty, now bore an ugly brownish stain down the front. Inspector Slack took it with evident anticipation. "Tea, you said," he remarked, examining the discoloured patch. "We'll let the lab chaps decide exactly what it is. But tell me this, Miss Bantry. If you spilled tea all down the front, how did a piece of the hem find its way into the kitchen waste bin with a bottle of cyanide pesticide?" Susan's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Raymond moved as if to go to her, then checked himself under Slack's sharp gaze. Miss Marple's voice, when it came, was mild as ever. "Sometimes, Inspector, young ladies tear their hems in gardens, particularly on rough boards such as those near the garden shed step. A frightened girl might attempt to conceal such evidence later, not because she is guilty of murder, but because she fears being thought so." Slack frowned. "And what exactly would she have to be frightened about, Miss Marple?" "Why," Miss Marple replied, her needles clicking softly again, "perhaps about something quite different from my murder. For instance, an unchaperoned meeting in the garden with a young man, or a conversation overheard that was never meant for her ears." Susan's eyes flew to hers, startled, guilty, and something else besides. In that instant, Miss Marple knew with quiet certainty that whatever Susan had concealed, it was not the simple act of tampering with a teacup. There were other secrets in this house yet, and at least one of them, she suspected, concerned not death, but an arrangement of futures that someone had been determined to prevent. For a moment no one spoke. The noisy ticking of the kitchen clock seemed suddenly very loud, marking off each uncomfortable second as Mrs. Price Ridley stood in the doorway, her habitual air of offended propriety slipping noticeably. Inspector Slack recovered first. "You were in this kitchen before the tea was taken out," he said sharply. "The maid says so herself. Perhaps you'd care to explain what business brought you here, Mrs. Price Ridley, aside from criticising the sandwiches?" She drew herself up. "I came, Inspector, because Mrs. Bantry asked me to see that the refreshments were properly arranged. As chairwoman of the Women's Institute Hospitality Committee, I am not accustomed to have my motives questioned." Miss Marple's needles clicked once, twice, then stilled. "You were also one of the first to speak with Mrs. Vane when she arrived, were you not?" she asked mildly. "You said she asked very particular questions about who was still in the village, and about property matters, quite an interest for a stranger." Mrs. Price Ridley hesitated. She inquired about certain investment, or she admitted reluctantly, about my late husband's business affairs. She seemed to know an alarming amount of detail for a woman who had never set foot in St. Mary Mead before. She implied that certain losses my husband suffered were not entirely accidental. The Colonel flinched visibly. Miss Marple noticed, but kept her gaze on Mrs. Price Ridley. "And that upset you very much, I expect, having such things mentioned, old wounds reopened, as it were?" "It was a disgraceful suggestion," Mrs. Price Ridley burst out. "My husband was an honourable man. If his ventures failed, it was through misplaced trust in others, not dishonesty. I told Mrs. Vane so most emphatically." Inspector Slack pounced. "And then you came straight to the kitchen, where the gardening poisons are frequently brought in to be locked away. A convenient opportunity if one wished to tamper with a teacup." "I did nothing of the sort." Her denial came a fraction too quickly. "I never even saw her teacup. I left by the side door and went back to the lawn." Miss Marple, who had watched this exchange with gentle interest, now spoke in her softest voice. "It is so curious, is it not, how Mrs. Vane seemed to know so much about everyone's affairs after only a few hours' visit. Dear Dolly mentioned that Millicent had been abroad most of her life, and yet she knew all about Major Harper's indiscreet second mortgage, Mrs. Price Ridley's investments, even poor Mr. Sims's unfortunate dismissal from the bank. Things never breathed outside the village. One wonders where she obtained such accurate information." Raymond West, who had been hovering protectively near Susan, shifted uneasily. "She had access to the firm's papers," he admitted. "Old files, letters. She asked to see everything connected with Bantry, Ridley, Harper, Sims and several others. She said she had reason to believe someone had been quietly bleeding them all for years through bad advice and private persuasion." The Colonel's shoulders sagged. Dolly gave a little cry. "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "I thought it might be something of that nature. We have seen it before in St. Mary Mead, in a smaller way to be sure. A trusted friend, a persuasive visitor with clever schemes, always just on the edge of fraud, never quite enough for the police. People are so loath to admit to having been foolish. They prefer to let the matter drop." Mrs. Price Ridley suddenly looked very ill. "Are you implying that I—" "Oh no, indeed," Miss Marple interrupted kindly. "I was thinking of someone else entirely. Someone who moved easily among all our little households years ago. Someone who had the entree everywhere." Her eyes, mild and faded, rested for the briefest instant on a Dolly Bantry, then on Susan, and finally on Raymond West. It is remarkable, is it not, how very much Miss Susan resembles a Vane rather than a Bantry if one knows the family? The eyes especially. Dolly made a choking sound, half sob, half protest. "Jane, you mustn't—" "I am afraid we have reached the point, dear Dolly, where we must," Miss Marple said quietly. "For I think Mrs. Vane did not come here merely about money or business failures. She came because she had discovered a far more intimate secret, a secret about family, about a child born under circumstances that were inconvenient, a child who had to be placed where she would be passed off as something else." Susan stared at her, stricken. "What are you saying?" "I am saying, my dear," Miss Marple replied with great gentleness, "that I think Mrs. Vane came to reclaim what she believed to be hers. Not property, not money, but a daughter." The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water. Colonel Bantry groaned aloud. Dolly covered her face with her hands, and in the doorway, unnoticed by most, Betty, the maid, let out a small frightened whisper. "So she did know." Inspector Slack swung round, startled. "Knew what, girl?" Betty's eyes, wide and terrified, fixed on Miss Marple as though begging her to speak or to stop. But Miss Marple only folded her knitting neatly in her lap, her expression very grave. "I think," she said softly, "that it is time we heard the whole story from the beginning. And perhaps," she added with the faintest emphasis, "not here in this upset kitchen. A quieter room might encourage memory. My cottage, for instance, has seen many little truths come to light over a nice ordinary cup of tea." Her suggestion, delivered with apparent innocence, was in fact the laying of a careful trap, a final test of nerves. For she had already seen, in the flicker of one particular face at the mention of the beginning, the telltale sign of someone whose carefully arranged lies were beginning, fatally to unravel. Late afternoon lights slanted across the rose garden as they returned to the arbour. The festive tables stood abandoned, cups and plates bearing mute witness to the sudden interruption of ordinary village life. Inspector Slack pushed ahead, his boots crunching on grille. But Miss Marple walked more slowly, her gaze travelling not to the bench where Millicent had died, but to the ground, immediately around it. "People always look at the body," she remarked mildly, "yet things dropped or hidden in haste are far more revealing." She moved a little way beyond the arbour, where a laurel hedge made a convenient screen from the house. Kneeling carefully, she parted the glossy leaves. "There, Inspector," she said. "You were quite right to think of poison, but wrong about where to look. Half hidden in the grass lay a second teacup, its matching saucer cracked, the remaining liquid dried to a faint yellowish crust." Inspector Slack stared. "But there was only one cup beside the body. I saw it myself." "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "This was the first cup, the one Mrs. Vane tasted, found unpleasant, and set aside. Our murderer could hardly leave it in view." Raymond West had gone very still. "Unpleasant?" "Cyanide has a bitter tang," Dr. Haydock answered gruffly. "A cautious person might notice it." "Just so," Miss Marple agreed. "Mrs. Vane was fastidious. She remarked that the tea tasted odd, poured it away and demanded fresh. Someone obliged her, smiling, and carried the first cup out of sight." She looked up at Raymond. "You were that someone, were you not?" All eyes swung towards him. He opened his mouth, closed it again. "She asked me to bring more tea," he said at last. "I took the cup away. I poured it on the ground there. I never went near the teapot." "But you went near the tray," Miss Marple replied quietly. "Betty left it unattended while fetching the sugar tongs. You already knew which cup would be offered to Mrs. Vane. A very small measure from a gardener's bottle is easily poured." Raymond's composure cracked. "I didn't mean to kill her," he burst out. "Only to frighten her. She was going to ruin us all. She said Susan was her daughter, that she'd take her away, expose the Bantrys, bankrupt my father over those old investments." He dragged a hand through his hair. "If she died before signing the new will, the charitable foundation would never exist. The old will leaving everything to Aunt Dolly would stand due. She could help the Colonel, help Father, help Susan. I thought it would look like her heart, or a seizure." "Not," Miss Marple said sadly. "You knew precisely what cyanide would do. You studied those failed companies for your father's firm, read all the reports. It was never a childish impulse, Mr. West, but a calculated act." Susan gave a choked sob. "Raymond, you fool! I would have gone with her gladly rather than this." Inspector Slack moved in grimly. The little procession moved out once more into the garden, though the late afternoon light had lost its earlier warmth. The rose arbour, so recently the scene of genteel tea-drinking, now had an air of faint sordidness, like a stage after the actors had left and the footlights gone out. Inspector Slack strode ahead, but it was Miss Marple who set the true pace, pausing here and there to examine the gravel, the trampled grass, the overturned chair that had been righted again by some zealous constable. She took her time in a way that made hurrying impossible for anyone else. "The thing about poison," she remarked mildly, addressing no one in particular, "is that it must be directed very precisely. One cannot depend on chance. A bullet may miss its intended target and strike another, but a poisoned cup of tea must reach exactly the person for whom it is intended." She paused by the wrought-iron bench, her fingers brushing the back of it as if in idle reminiscence. "There were 6 ladies present who took tea this afternoon," she went on. "All served from the same pot, Betty tells us. The only difference lay in the cups, and in the knowledge of which cup was meant for Mrs. Vane." Raymond West shifted uneasily. "You've already suggested that my asking about the best china was suspicious, Miss Marple. I think that quite unfair." "Not at all, dear boy," she said kindly. "Young people are often gallant, but murderers are seldom gallant. They're usually practical." Her pale eyes rested thoughtfully on his face before drifting to Susan, who stood a little apart, arms wrapped around herself. Miss Marple turned suddenly to Inspector Slack. Might we reenact the serving of the tea, Inspector? I find it so much easier to think when my old eyes can see how people moved." Slack grunted but acquiesced. The tray, cups and teapot were fetched from the kitchen. Betty, pale but resolute, took her position by the path leading to the arbour. "I brought it this way, miss," she explained. "Mrs. Vane had already come here. She said she'd wait." "And the tray stood—" "Where?" Miss Marple asked. "On that little table, just there." Miss Marple nodded and turned, her voice very soft. "And when you realised you had forgotten the sugar tongs, you left the tray and went back inside. The tray was unattended for, what did you say, Betty? A minute? Perhaps less? About that, miss." Miss Marple let her gaze travel slowly over the little gathering. Colonel and Dolly Bantry, stiff with dread. Susan, white and shaken. Mrs. Price Ridley, brittle with poorly concealed fear. And Raymond, whose eyes could not quite meet hers. "Such a convenient minute," Miss Marple murmured. "Time enough for someone to exchange one cup for another, or to add a few drops from a very small bottle into just one cup." She looked back at Inspector Slack. "You told us, Inspector, that your men have taken the cups for fingerprint examination?" Slack, who had said nothing of the kind, opened his mouth, then, catching the glint in Miss Marple's eye, shut it again and merely grunted non-committally. It was enough. Mrs. Price Ridley gave a kind of strangled gasp and clutched her pearls tighter. Colonel Bantry's hand went reflexively to his moustache. Susan stared, bewildered, but Raymond West flinched just slightly, just enough, and his right hand moved involuntarily toward his breast pocket, as if to guard something that was no longer there. Miss Marple saw it all. "Fingerprints can be such awkward things," she went on gently, as if reminiscing about jam-making. "Of course, really clever people wear gloves, or they wipe things carefully afterward. But clever people, properly clever, also avoid leaving such obvious evidence as torn silk placed just so, or poison bottles left where any maid might empty a bin." Her knitting needles clicked once in the quiet that followed. "No," she added softly, "this murderer relied less on science and more on character, on knowing that a frightened girl would seem a likely culprit, that a foolish old financial quarrel would fix suspicion on a distressed wife, and that a village quite unused to murder would grasp at the nearest simple explanation." She looked up at Raymond at last, meeting his eyes fully. "It is a very lawyer-like crime," she said almost regretfully, "drafted, as it were, with considerable foresight, but with one tiny human oversight." Raymond swallowed. "And what oversight would that be, Miss Marple?" "The oversight," she replied, "of assuming that no one noticed who was in the garden at the precise moment when Mrs. Vane raised her cup to her lips, nor why a man who professed disinterest in family money should be so very alarmed at the prospect of a new will and a charitable foundation." She smiled, a faint, sorrowful little smile. "Shall we talk, Mr. West, about Hartley development, misappropriated funds, and a woman who had finally put all the pieces together?" In the weeks that followed the tragedy at Gossington Hall, St. Mary Mead settled back into its accustomed rhythm, though with a faint stiffness, like a village that had stumbled and was determined no one should notice. The roses bloomed, the vicar preached, the grocer continued to weigh out sugar with solemn precision. But conversations broke off when certain names were mentioned, and there was a new, almost respectful note in the way people spoke of what happened at the Bantrys. Dolly herself had gone quietly, almost gratefully, to the distant cousin by the northern sea. There had been doctors' certificates about her nerves, and much talk, both legal and otherwise, of long strain, sudden provocation, and a woman driven beyond endurance by the threat to the child of her heart. The law, being administered by human beings, chose a course that was neither wholly merciful nor wholly severe, and Colonel Bantry, though greyer and suddenly older, bore it with the rigid, dazed stoicism of a soldier who has seen a battle disastrously lost. Susan spent some weeks in bed with what the village delicately called a collapse. Afterwards she went up to friends in town. It was mentioned without detail that her engagement to Raymond West had been postponed, a word that in St. Mary Mead could mean anything from next month to never. Miss Marple, who understood both youth and time, suspected that the matter was not nearly so settled as the village supposed. One clear October afternoon Raymondton came down alone. He prowled Miss Marple's neat little sitting room with the energy of a caged animal while she knitted, peacefully counting stitches. "I cannot understand it, Aunt Jane," he burst out at last. "To think of Aunt Dolly, of all people, doing such a thing, I can't fit it into my mind." Miss Marple looked up, her blue eyes very gentle. My dear boy, you're thinking of Dolly as she appeared at garden parties. A nice, comfortable woman who fussed over sandwiches and worried about the asparagus bed. But people are never just what they seem in one setting. There are whole continents of feeling beneath what we show at tea. She poisoned a woman, Raymond said harshly. Surely that's not just a question of continents of feeling. Oh, murder is always a question of feelings, said Miss Marple mildly. People kill for what they love, or for what they fear. Millicent Vane arrived brandishing both money and knowledge. She could ruin Colonel Bantry over those speculative investments. She could tear Susan's life to pieces with the story of a child given up and now to be claimed. Dolly stood between them like a mother cat. Such creatures can be very gentle, until someone reaches for the kitten. Raymond flung himself into a chair. But it wasn't even true about Susan being her daughter. No, Miss Marple agreed. But Millicent believed it, or found it convenient to believe. And you must remember, Susan did not know it was false. Imagine being told suddenly that you are not who you think you are, that your very name is uncertain. Dolly saw that horror in the girl's face and she could not bear it. She chose very wrongly to remove the cause instead of bearing the pain. And the others? Raymond asked. You spoke of webs and tangles. There were many strands, Miss Marple said. Mrs. Price Ridley, with her old scandal and her fear of exposure. The Colonel, with his foolish ventures and the threat of disgrace. Even you, dear boy, with your father's papers and knowledge of the will. Millicent Vane came down like a stone into a pond. The ripples touched everyone. In such water, it is easy for a desperate woman to believe that if she strikes once, cleanly, everything will be still again. Raymond was silent for a time. Outside, a cart rattled past. Somewhere a dog barked. Everyday sounds, Miss Marple thought, that continued serenely whatever storms shook individual hearts. At least, he said finally, Susan is free of it now. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. One is never quite free of such things, she said, but one can grow around them, like a tree round an old wound. Susan has learned something about the precariousness of life and about the force of love, both its gentleness and its violence. If you're wise, you will not hurry her. Wounds close better without prodding. Raymond looked at her, curiously. Do you think she will ever— My dear, said Miss Marple, smiling faintly, young people are remarkably resilient, and you are both, I think, capable of learning. That is more than can be said for many. He rose to go presently, and she walked with him to the little gate. When he had gone, striding away down the lane, Miss Marple stood for a moment looking at the quiet street. The familiar gables, the smoke rising peacefully from chimneys. Murder, she reflected, did not so much break the pattern of village life as reveal it, showing in sharp outline the grudges, fears, loyalties, and desperate affections that ordinarily lay concealed beneath politeness and routine. Human nature, she knew, was much the same everywhere. In St. Mary Mead, in great houses like Gossington, in London flats. Given the right pressure, the mildest-seeming person could do a dreadful thing. She sighed, not altogether unhappily, and went back indoors where the kettle was beginning to sing. There was some new wool to wind, and a pattern to consider, and no doubt, sooner or later, another little disturbance in the even surface of village life that would need, quietly and without fuss, to be put right. The annual Rose and Dahlia show at St. Mary Mead had begun, as it always did, with the wrangle about tablecloths. Mrs. Price Ridley maintained that white damask showed off the blooms to best advantage, while Mrs. Hartnell, more practical and considerably more red in the face, insisted that anything which did not betray beetroot stains would be a blessing. Miss Marple, in a hat trimmed with a sensible quantity of faded violets, sat quietly in a corner near the jam display and knitted baby booties of pale lemon wool, her blue eyes apparently more interested in a drop stitch than in the contest of wills. It was a fine June afternoon, the sort which made even the most hardened gossip feel benign. The vicar, Reverend Leonard Clement, moved among his parishioners with a slightly distracted smile, as though some private preoccupation tugged at his sleeve. His wife, Griselda, bright and careless in a dress a little too sophisticated for the church hall, laughed at him openly. "You look as though you had preached the Sermon on the Mount and discovered no one had listened," she said. "Do stop brooding, Leonard. The roses are doing their best for you, even if the congregation is not." "If only roses were as easy to manage as souls," he murmured, and then coloured faintly, for Miss Marple's needles had paused quite distinctly. At 3 o'clock precisely, just as the judging of the preserves was to commence, Mr. Arthur Sims, the churchwarden, mounted the little platform and tapped for silence. His bald head gleamed with righteous perspiration. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "before we proceed to the awards, The vicar has, a short announcement of a personal nature. There was at once a rustle through the hall, the soft stir of anticipatory scandal. Miss Hartnell sniffed loudly. Griselda's head turned sharply towards her husband. Only Miss Marple continued to look down, smoothing a length of wool between her fingers. Leonard Clement stepped forward. His usual mildness had deserted him. His face was curiously pale, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his spectacles. "My friends," he said, and his voice wavered. "You have, many of you, been kind enough to regard me as not only your vicar, but your friend. I wish to say something which I fear may alter your opinion of me. It concerns an event long past, but one which has consequences in the present." "That'll be a woman," whispered Mrs. Price Ridley to her neighbour, with grim certainty. "Mark my words!" Before he could continue, the door at the far end of the hall banged open with startling violence. A young woman stood on the threshold breathless, her fair hair dishevelled, a cheap little hat askew on her head. Her dress of bright blue artificial silk was travel-creased and wholly unsuitable for the decorous gloom of the church hall. "Reverend Clement!" she cried, her voice carrying clearly above the murmur that rose. "You must stop this at once! He has been murdered!" The word seemed to fall like a stone into a still pond. Ripples of horror and incredulity spread outward. Someone dropped a plate. Somewhere else a child began to cry. Griselda caught at her husband's arm. Who has been murdered?" she demanded. The girl's eyes, very blue and very desperate, swept the room and came to rest, with a strange intensity, on the vicar's stricken face. "Your son," she said. "Your son, Mr. Clement. They've killed him on the common." The silence which followed was total. Only Miss Marple, whose knitting had slipped unheeded into her lap, looked not startled, but very, very attentive. For a moment no one moved. It was as though the entire assembly of St. Mary Mead had been transformed into wax figures, posed around teacups and plum cakes, eyes fixed upon the stranger and the vicar. Reverend Ashford recovered first, though his voice trembled. "Lydia," he said quietly, "this is neither the time nor the place." "On the contrary," the woman replied, her tone controlled but vibrating with emotion. "It is precisely the time. You've hidden long enough." A rustle of shocked whispers stirred the crowd like a breeze through corn. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, eyes shining with avid curiosity. "Lydia," she repeated under her breath. "I don't recall any Lydia. Do you, Jane?" Miss Marple's fingers returned calmly to their knitting. "Names come and go, Dolly," she said mildly, "although some have a habit of returning when least convenient." Constance suddenly found her voice. "Father," she cried, half-choked, "what is she talking about? What son?" Reverend Ashford winced as though struck. He looked around, his gaze passing over the parishioners, over Mrs. Fletcher, rigid and staring, and finally alighting on Miss Marple under the oak. Something like resignation settled over his features. "Everyone," he said, clearing his throat, "I must ask you to excuse us. This is a private matter." It was, of course, the last thing anyone in St. Mary Mead intended to do, excuse themselves from a scene promising so much, but there was something in the vicar's voice, an authority unused but still present, that compelled a degree of obedience. People drifted back toward their seats and tables, though not so far that they could not hear should any raised voices emerge from the vicarage. Lydia's eyes flashed. "Private, you made it very public when you abandoned me to raise your child alone." A collective gasp went up, quickly smothered, but no less heartfelt. Miss Hartnell actually clutched at her pearls in a gesture so theatrical it might have seemed comic under other circumstances. "Please," the vicar said hoarsely, "come inside. We will talk there." He did not touch Lydia, but he gestured toward the French doors opening onto the lawn. For a moment it seemed she might defy him. Then, with a tight, proud lift of her chin, she turned and walked toward the house. Reverend Ashford followed, shoulders bowed. As the doors closed behind them, the garden erupted into low-pitched, buzzing conversation. "Well," Mrs. Bantry breathed, thoroughly energized. "A secret love child! In St. Mary Mead! Jane, did you ever—" Miss Marple's needles clicked placidly. "People are very much the same everywhere, Dolly," she said. "Even in St. Mary Mead, particularly in St. Mary Mead." "But the vicar," Mrs. Bantry protested. "Our vicar." "Vicars," observed Mrs. Marple, "are first and foremost men. One must never forget that. It saves a deal of disappointment." Near the tea-table, Colonel Melchett, who had arrived in his capacity as patron of the fete, and not, he would have said, as chief constable, was frowning with professional concern. Dash it all, he muttered to Inspector Slack, who had been conscripted to help judge the jam competition and now looked as though he would rather be facing an armed burglar. This will be all over the county by tomorrow. It'll be all over the village by this evening, sir, Slack returned grimly, eyeing the chattering guests. And that lady, Lydia, was it? Didn't look the type to go quietly. Under the oak, Miss Marple watched Constance. The girl stood utterly still, face white, hands clenched in the folds of her black dress. Mrs. Diz. Fletcher had moved to her side, one work-worn hand resting awkwardly on the girl's arm. Yet it was not maternal comfort Miss Marple saw there, but something tighter, warier, almost proprietorial. Poor child, Miss Marple murmured. Which one? Mrs. Bantry asked, distracted. Oh, said Miss Marple, her needles gleaming in the dappled light. I rather think several. Inside the vicarage, a door slammed. By 6 o'clock that evening, the vicarage garden bore no trace of bunting or trestle tables, only flattened grass and a few stray paper napkins caught in the rose bushes, testified to the earlier festivity. Yet in the cottages and parlours of St. Mary Mead, the echoes of the afternoon's drama had only just begun to swell. At the Blue Boar, where a few of the more adventurous villagers had gone for an early supper, the landlord found himself pouring far more pints than usual. I always said, declared Mr. Toms, the butcher, thumping his glass down with unnecessary force, there was something a bit too saintly about our Reverend Ashford. Never trust a man who smiles that much. Hides things, that sort does. Rubbish, Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed from her corner table, though her eyes shone with avid curiosity. All this modern talk about past mistakes being dragged into the open, perfectly deplorable. If the poor man had a lapse of judgment in his youth, that's no business of ours. Lapse of judgment? Mr. Tom snorted. Secret love child, more like. And that London woman, Miss Hartley, did she say? Marching in like a queen with a grievance. Mark my words, she's after money. Major Weatherby, who prided himself on military logic, cleared his throat. If the boy's 18, as she claimed, then all this happened before Ashford came to St. Mary Mead, pre-village history. Can't hold that against him, eh? Damned awkward, of course, but not criminal. People do not travel all the way from London, Mrs. Price Ridley observed, to make scenes at garden parties unless they have a very particular reason. In her cosy sitting room on the high street, Miss Marple sat with a tray table laid with a carefully prepared supper. A slice of cold ham, some pickled beetroot, a wedge of cheese, and a small brown teapot. The baby booties lay completed beside her chair, absurdly innocent in their pale yellow softness. Well, Raymond, she said aloud, addressing the framed photograph of her nephew, it appears our peaceful village has acquired a complication. A secret son, an anxious housekeeper, an oddly composed vicar, and a stranger who has practised her speech in front of a mirror. Such a lot of human nature in one small garden. She poured herself another cup of tea and considered the matter dispassionately. It was not the existence of a love child that interested her. She had lived too long and seen too much to be shocked by lapses in clerical morality. It was rather the different flavours of reaction, Constance's bewildered anger, Mrs. Fletcher's near panic, the vicar's strange air of weary relief, and old Badgers the gardener, whose retreating back had spoken of something more than distaste. Resentment, Miss Marple murmured, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. Long-standing resentment and sudden revelation. That combination, in my experience, is rarely without consequences. Outside, the church clock struck the half-hour. At the vicarage, a light shone in the study window, a small square of yellow in the deepening blue of evening. Somewhere within that room, Miss Hartley, the vicar, and perhaps Mrs. Fletcher were talking, arguing, remembering. Truths were being dragged from their hiding places. And in St. Mary Mead, truth had a way of upsetting far more than reputations. Mrs. Fletcher clutched the doorframe as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. For a brief, disconcerting moment she stared straight ahead, her eyes unfocused before they lay fixed on Constance and Miss Marple making their way across the lawn. "Miss Marple," she called, her voice cracking oddly on the name. "Miss Marple, if you please." Constance reached her first. "What is it? Where's father? Where is that woman?" Mrs. Fletcher's mouth worked soundlessly before any words emerged. "Your father. He's taken ill. It's the shock, I suppose. Miss Hartley is with him. I must fetch Dr. Haydock at once." Miss Marple laid a light, steadying hand on the housekeeper's arm. "Of course, Mrs. Fletcher. But perhaps, before you go, we might see for ourselves that the vicar is as comfortable as circumstances permit." For an instant something very like panic flickered in Mrs. Fletcher's eyes. Then she stepped aside with mechanical politeness. Yes, of course. Only don't excite him. He's had a trying afternoon. The sitting room beyond the French doors bore all the marks of hasty, heated confrontation. A chair lay overturned, its cushion askew. The small occasional table by the fireplace had been knocked sideways, scattering papers and spilling ink onto the carpet. A coffee cup lay shattered near the hearth, its dark contents seeping slowly into the rug like congealing blood. On the sofa, Reverend Ashford sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together as if in prayer. His complexion had the greyish tinge of a man who has received a mortal blow of the emotional kind. Beside him stood the auburn-haired woman, Miss Hartley, her gloved hands clenched around a folded handkerchief. Her face, though pale, burned with an anger that seemed to war with something softer. "Father!" Constance hurried to his side, dropping to her knees before him. "Are you all right?" Mrs. Fletcher said. "I am quite all right, my dear," the vicar said, though his voice emerged thin and strained. "Merely tired. Events have accumulated rather suddenly." Miss Marple stepped just inside the doorway, careful to disturb nothing. Her eyes flicked briefly over the room, the scattered papers, the overturned chair, the ink, the broken cup. Quarrels, she reflected, rarely kept within the boundaries of coasters and conversational distance. "You mustn't distress yourself, Reverend Ashford," she said mildly. "Shock is a most exhausting thing, particularly for one of sensitive conscience." Miss Hartley gave a short, bitter laugh. "Sensitive conscience, that's one way of putting it." She looked down at the vicar. "Tell them, Timothy. Tell them about Daniel." "Daniel?" Constance's voice sounded very small. "His name is Daniel?" "Yes," Miss Hartley replied, her tone softening. "Daniel Hartley. He's 18, clever, stubborn, proud, very much his father's son." The vicar winced. Whether at the description or the ownership it implied, Miss Marple could not be entirely certain. He should have been here," he murmured. "I asked him to come, but he refused. Said if I wanted to claim him, I could do so alone." Miss Marple's eyebrows rose ever so slightly. "You invited him, then, to the garden party?" A faint nod. "I wrote to him last month. Told him I intended to acknowledge him publicly. He said I was a coward and a hypocrite. That if I had wanted to be a father, I should have begun 18 years ago." Miss Hartley's fingers tightened on the handkerchief. "So I came in his place, to see if you meant it, to see what kind of man my son's father had become." Constance rose slowly, looking from her father to Miss Hartley with wide, wounded eyes. "You were going to tell everyone today, during the party, and you said nothing to me." "I meant to," the vicar whispered. "Afterward, when I had found the words." From the doorway came a small, decisive cough. Mrs. Fletcher, who had not yet departed for Dr. Haydock despite her declaration, hovered there with an air of uneasy impatience. "If I'm to fetch the doctor, I had best go now," she said. "You'll all be wanting your tea, Leah." Miss Marple regarded her with mild curiosity. "You knew of Daniel, of course, Mrs. Fletcher?" The housekeeper's hands twisted in her apron. "I've kept this house 18 years, Miss Marple. I know what comes in and what goes out, that's all." "But not," Miss Marple said gently, "what is kept hidden in between. Mrs. Fletcher's gaze flickered nervously toward the vicar, then away. "I'll fetch the doctor," she repeated, and slipped out with a swiftness that belied her years. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind arranging the fragments of the afternoon like the pieces of a very delicate pattern. There was fear in this house, she decided. Fear, resentment, and a secret grown too large to contain. And such things, in her experience, were fertile soil for tragedy. Doctor Haydock arrived with his usual brisk efficiency, his black bag swinging at his side, Inspector Slack close on his heels with an expression of grim anticipation. Constance followed behind them, pale and wide-eyed, clinging to the doorframe as though it might steady her spinning world. "Where is she?" de Haydock demanded. "In here, Doctor," Miss Marple replied, stepping aside to allow him access to the study. She watched intently as he knelt beside Miss Hartley, his practised fingers checking for a pulse, then gently lifting one of the woman's eyelids. Slack hovered nearby, his sharp eyes darting between the body, the vicar, and Miss Marple. "No one touches anything," he barked, more from habit than necessity. His gaze narrowed on Reverend Ashford. "You've not moved her, sir?" The vicar shook his head slowly. "She collapsed while we were talking. I called for Mrs. Fletcher, but—" his voice faltered. "But you didn't think to send for the doctor at once?" Slack's tone was coolly accusatory. "There was so much being said," the vicar replied, sounding dazed rather than defensive. "I thought she had fainted." Haydock rose to his feet, his face grave. "She's dead," he said simply. "Has been for some minutes at least. Rigour hasn't set in yet, but the lividity is beginning. And look at the lips, Slack. That bluish tinge, and the pupils. I don't care for it." "Meaning what exactly, Doctor?" Slack asked, though his voice had taken on a certain alert sharpness. "I mean, it doesn't look like heart failure or a simple faint. I'd say poison, tentatively. But you'll get your proper answer from the post-mortem." And his eyes strayed to the tea tray. "She drank anything just before she went down?" "Tea," Miss Marple said quietly. "There are 3 cups. One broken on the floor. Presumably Miss Hartley's. And you see, Inspector, how the other 2 are full and quite cool. That suggests she alone drank and the gentleman did not." Slack shot her a wary look. He was used to Miss Marple's deceptively mild comments leading somewhere inconvenient. "And why didn't they drink then?" Reverend Ashford seemed to rouse himself. "Our discussion, our argument, became quite heated. I hardly remember the tea at all. Miss Hartley poured herself a cup while telling me what she intended to do. She said she would introduce my son to the village, expose me from the pulpit itself if needed." "And where is this son?" Slack demanded sharply. "In London," the vicar answered slowly. "Or he was, until last week. She said she had brought him down near here, that he would arrive soon." Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. "You'll want the scene left as is, Slack. I'll ring the coroner. In the meantime, you might ask who prepared this tea." All eyes turned almost as one toward Mrs. Fletcher, who had lingered in the doorway as though hoping to remain unnoticed. Her hands twisted in her apron, and her voice, when it came, was thin and shaking. "I did, Inspector," she whispered. "But I swear on my soul there was nothing wrong with it when I carried it in." Miss Marple watched the woman's trembling hands and lowered eyes, her own expression politely blank. She had seen such hands before, in another village many years ago, belonging to a woman who had not poisoned anyone herself, but who knew very well who had. Miss Marple walked back toward the house with the unhurried step of an elderly lady with nothing in particular to do, though her mind moved with far greater speed. At the French doors she paused. Through the gap in the curtains she could see Inspector Slack taking down notes while Dr. Haydock spoke in low tones. Constance stood just outside the study, clinging to the doorframe. Her face was still pale, but her eyes burned with a fierce, bewildered anger. "Is it true?" she demanded as Miss Marple approached. "They're saying Miss Hartley was poisoned at our vicarage during our garden party. It sounds like something out of a dreadful crime novel." "Fiction often borrows from life, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently, "and life is unfortunately not obliged to be reasonable." Constance swallowed hard. "They think father did it, don't they, because of what she said about the son? The police are obliged to consider the most obvious explanation first," Miss Marple said, her voice mild. "Is not always the correct one." "Father wouldn't hurt anyone," Constance insisted. He's weak sometimes, yes. He avoids unpleasantness until it becomes worse, but murder, no, I don't believe it." Miss Marple merely patted her arm and turned as Inspector Slack emerged from the study, shutting the door firmly behind him. "Body'll stay where it is until the coroner's seen it," he announced briskly. "No one is to enter that room. Reverend Ashford, I'm afraid I must ask you not to leave the vicarage for the time being. Routine procedure." "Am I under arrest?" the vicar asked quietly. "Not yet, sir, but you've got more motive than most." Slack turned to Mrs. Fletcher. "You too, Mrs. Fletcher. I'll need a full statement in the morning. For tonight, keep to your room after supper, and no more tea being poured in this house if you don't mind." Mrs. Fletcher nodded, looking as if the instruction about tea were the final straw in an already impossible day. "I shall walk home now, Inspector," Miss Marple said, serenely. "I imagine there will be little more to see tonight." He eyed her with suspicion. "You'll be seeing plenty, I've no doubt, Miss Marple. Just don't go filling people's heads with your notions before I've had a chance to interview them." "One wouldn't dream of interfering," Miss Marple replied, and if Slack had known her better, he might have found that reassurance rather less comforting. On the lane outside the vicarage, she encountered Mrs. Bantry's motor car drawing up with a squeal of brakes. Mrs. Bantry herself leaned out, eyes alight. "Jane, is it true, murder at the vicarage? Get in at once, you're coming back to Gossington and telling me everything." Miss Marple allowed herself to be shepherded into the passenger seat. As they rattled down the lane, Mrs. Bantry bombarded her with questions, but Miss Marple answered only the most basic, her mind fitting together details like pieces of patchwork. "A love child, Mrs. Diz," Bantry said, almost with relish. "And the mother turning up after all these years. It's like that case of yours, the one with the colonel and the barmaid." "There are certain similarities," Miss Marple admitted, "though here I think the pattern may be more tangled. Did you notice Mrs. Fletcher's behaviour, Dolly? She was not merely shocked, she was frightened. And our Mr. Badger's too, he knew more than he wished to. Mrs. Bantry frowned. Do you think they're hiding the boy, the vicar's son? I rather think, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, that the boy may not be nearly so hidden as all that, Mrs. Bantry stared at her. Jane, what on earth do you mean? But Miss Marple merely folded her hands over her knitting bag and looked out at the darkening hedgerows, her expression as mild and unreadable as ever, while in her mind a quiet little village map of relationships, scandals and opportunities for murder continued to grow more detailed by the minute.